All right, AP Human Geography. It's video note time. One more time. All right. Well, no, and I very much doubt the last time. So where we finished things off last was more or less in this department here. We were introducing ourselves to Johann von Thunen and his little model for how agriculture is kind of organizes itself, and again does this by picking up on what he kind of looks upon as predictable patterns. All right, and it's not a perfect model. We talked about some of the parts of it that make sense, and the parts of it that were a little bit more of a stretch. The last two that we have up there, number 5 and 6, those are ones that make sense. That those apply today as much as they did back in 1826 when all of this von Thunen business was first unleashed on the world. All right, so here's where we need to get good and familiar with this diagram, okay? And yes, you are going to need to know this thing front, back, up, down. You need to have a complete understanding. Good chance, really good chance, some version of this shows up on the AP test. I can guarantee you it's going to show up on your Unit 5 test that you're going to take from me. And you're going to want a clear understanding of what each of these zones are. Okay, it makes this cute little bullseye kind of thing. But you need to have a complete understanding and the ability to explain this thing forwards and backwards. Okay, just being able to identify. Oh, number one is the marketplace, and number two describes a market gardening zone. Not good enough. Okay, you're going to need to be able to really get into the weeds, to use an agricultural term, with being the level of detail. Okay, so let's break it down. All right, I'll start you off with this, and again, you'll by the time we get done with this, man, you're gonna get some, like I said, you're gonna get some Mr. Sin's take on it. You'll get your textbook's take on it. There's no way that you cover Unit 5 without a good dunking in the world of von Thunen. Okay, so what you have there in that dark blue, right? Number one, boom, the marketplace. It's also identified as an urban center. And so usually, whether we're talking about a big city, a small village, and this would, if we're applying it back to von Thunen's time, this would be more like a village kind of a thing. But regardless of the size, you're going to always have a center of whatever kind of an urban setting you're looking at. Okay, and when we use that word urban, boom, we're talking about cities. Okay, and so what they're talking about is that commonly back in those days, in the early days, we mentioned this in class. They didn't have grocery stores the way we have nowadays, but you had marketplaces where farmers would bring whatever it is they grew or raised, and they would sell it. Okay, and the people from that village, that town, and surrounding areas would come in usually on during what were kind of predetermined market days, and they'd do their shopping for the week or for a couple weeks, that kind of a thing. Okay, and so that is always going to be at the center of the model that von Thunen creates back in 1826. Okay, everything always is kind of gravitates around this urban center where you have the markets, where the farmers, the people involved in all this agricultural activity are going to sell their wares. Because remember, one of his assumptions is, we're in this in a business model. We're in it to make money. We're in it to make profits, and that's where you make your profits. It's at the market. Okay, that's number one. All right, number two is what we call a horticulture zone. Okay. And horticulture, you've got your examples that I have there. Okay, you've got dairy farming. Sorry, I'm babysitting 3 dogs, and one of them needed to go outside for a moment. Anyhow, where I was talking about there in the number 2, the light blue zone, or horticulture zone. Yes, dairy farming. MG, market gardening. Okay, which you can go back and look a little earlier in your notes where we talked about that. And then especially crops that have a high perishability rate. Okay, crops that you're not going to be able to keep them around for long. So there's and think about dairy is kind of the same idea. Milk, eggs, cheese, things like that. The spoilage rate is going to be far higher, and so it makes sense that's going to be the zone that's closest to the market gardening. It's going to be the shortest distance. and so distance decay is not going to be as much of an issue there. And the farmers who are involved in that economic activity, market gardening and dairy farming, are going to be able to get those the output of that to market before it can go bad. All right. So that is your horticulture zone represented on our little bullseye in the light blue. Okay. Your forest zone. There you go. The green band. It's after that. Now, that isn't really what we consider to be agricultural activity. Okay. It's definitely something that was needed especially back in those days where, you didn't want to deal with the transportation of really, really heavy materials like timber. And so, this is a pattern that von Thunen recognizes might not look as applicable when we look nowadays at, the way this zone operates, because, a lot of those transportation issues we've been able to solve with more modern modes of transportation. But that forest zone usually is what did supply the materials that were needed for building homes, for building businesses, for building, some of the what you're going to see there in that urban center, some of the businesses, even the marketplaces. That's where you get. So you don't really want to think of that necessarily as a straight up agricultural, because it's a different kind of a usage where, everything else we're going to see, it all revolves around agricultural products that, are going to in part, lend themselves towards human consumption and, things like that. Okay. So that's your forest zone. And then we've got the orange, okay, number 4 on the number 4 ring there. And that is our grain zone. And so wheat and corn are a couple of big ones there. Nowadays, you might see soybeans and other kinds of grains that might be thrown in the mix with that as well. But this is going to be the zone. These are crops that the spoilage or perishability rate is not anywhere near as bad. You can store these, you can dry them, and transport them from longer distance and not have to worry about them going bad. And so they can be a little further on out there. Okay. And then your 5th zone is that livestock zone. Okay. And so this is where we need, and why the reason why it's the furthest out. A couple of things you can go with this. First of all, you're going to need more land because now you have animals that you're grazing. Right. And especially back in 1826, where there's going to be more of kind of, natural grazing, where you're letting animals just kind of roam around and just feed off of what's growing, out of the ground versus, supplying them with hay or supplying them with grain to eat, that sort of thing. Okay. The other reason you can extend the ranching and livestock zone way out there is because they can self-transport themselves to the marketplace. No one is suggesting that, whether, we're talking about, cattle or pigs or sheep or whatever, they're not going to slaughter them out there in that livestock and zone and then transport, the meat to the marketplace. Instead, they will drive the animals while they're still alive across the other zones to the marketplace. And then, they're going to be either slaughtered there and then the product sold there at the marketplace, or they're going to be sold while they're still alive. And the people who then purchase them will then, follow through with the rest of the process and slaughter them and, get the meat prepared and, all that kind of thing. Okay. And so those are your 5 zones. You want to know the order in which they roll out, starting with that marketplace, that center, and then all the way out the order, with the ranching and livestock, that livestock zone being the one that is furthest out. And again, all based on patterns that von Thunen is seeing repeated over and over and over again in his home country of Germany and some of the nearby European countries that he applies this to. And again, it's not like he's saying this is the way it should be. He's saying that, well, this is what I see when I look at this. And no, it's not in perfect circles like this. Okay, he's simplifying as he's creating this model. But again, it's a model that because there's some predictability to it, because you see this repeated over and over again. Again, it informs us and it kind of gives us some information in terms of how we can think about if a new area is coming under development. and where in those zones are you going to fit where people live? Where are you going to, it starts to bring in some other elements. Okay, all right. Now we'll jump into some other. Some of these have some connection back to von Thunen. Um, and I'd say the bid rent curve definitely plays into this. And what this is you can kind of take a look at my little diagram I have over here on the side, and it pretty much is talking about your value of land. Okay, they call it the bid rent curve. In other words, what are people willing to bid to be able to acquire land, whether they're purchasing it or renting that land. And so what if we go back, if I go back to my prior slide and we get back to our bullseye, what the bid rent curve is pretty much going to say is your most valuable land is going to be right there at dead center. Okay, it's the urban center, it's the marketplace, and then you're going to see the further on out you go, the value of that land is going to decline. Okay, it's going to get less and less expensive as you go down the through, and that's where you see kind of this curve that is way up there, high rent. Okay, a lot of people, the land is in demand in that center. But then as you start to extend out and you're moving through the different zones, and pretty soon you're out there into livestock zones. Yeah, the value of that, there's not as many people who are going to be fighting over that land, who desire that land. And so it's going to get less and less expensive. Okay. And so the bid rent curve just gives us kind of a little bit of a visual representation and just the understanding. Okay. That, depending on how that agricultural land is being used, is going to impact the value of it, the perceived value of it and the real value of it, and what people are willing to spend to acquire that land if they're getting into farming or agricultural activity themselves. All right. And yes, this is, and folks, this hasn't changed, right? It hasn't changed in 200 years. And that is that whatever is identified as kind of the center of a marketplace. Okay. Nowadays we would look at big cities like Vancouver or Portland, or further on up the road in Seattle. Okay. We've already talked about in here, and we'll hit this again when we get into Unit 6, is that, the most expensive real estate in our own country is always going to exist in the biggest cities. And because it is just supply demand. There's more people that want to live in those areas. There's more businesses because they know there's more customer base. There's more businesses that want to open up in those locations. And so everything costs more when the closer you are into that center marketplace, right? And if we think of the big cities, our big urban centers, as those marketplaces, it's just kind of common sense that you're going to pay more, per square foot of land in those areas. Okay, and then as you get further on out into more, sparsely populated, less demand, more rural. Okay, the value of that land is going to continually decline in value. All right, that's what we're talking about with all of that bid rent curve, but understand the concept there. Again, I don't think it's a very complicated one. Okay, some other applications we can make to von Thunen's model. It goes beyond agriculture. Okay, if we think about, really just that general idea, if we apply the bid rent curve to the little bullseye design of von Thunen's model, we can look at that when we look at cities where there's not a lot of agriculture. We can look at that in cities that are very industrialized and have a lot of manufacturing and factories that go into them. And that's where we see the application of von Thunen's model that's still kind of the elements of that still survive into the 21st century. Is that when we talk about, the people who lead, our cities, the people who lead our counties, and the people who lead our states, as we get more and more kind of local government, we elect those people, we select those people to lead us in part so that they can basically lead us responsibly into the future, and that they can plan for possible, further growth to a city, and then the suburbs around it, or, the potential of loss of population, and the adjustments that have to be made so that, you are living in a place where you can, number one, afford to live. and that services aren't too expensive. And number two, you can live in a place where, where the livability is really good, and you feel happy to live where you're at. All those kind of elements means that you have to have government leaders that are always looking to the future. And that's where you use these predictive models that are based on reality and based on patterns that you see repeated over and over again. Is it can give you a little bit of a view into the future. And when you get right down to it, von Thunen's model is a pretty simple one to predict, because wherever you're going to see those market centers end up forming, that things are going to kind of roll from there. That's going to be the high cost area where everyone's going to be the highest demand. And then you're going to see these successive, as that bid rent curve gets into action, you're going to see these successive zones that are going to get just a little less, a little less, a little less, a little less expensive as the value of that land declines, because the demand won't be as much there. All right. Oh, another dog. Hold on. I don't know. If you recall, I have 3 dogs here at home, and sometimes they don't coordinate well on, needing to use the outside. Anyhow, so let's talk about this one. We talked about one of the weaknesses of von Thunen's model was this assumption about isotropic geography, this flat featureless, which we all know is, it's like, yeah, right. That image over on the right side, there you go. There's dealing with, on the left side, the perfect little model, and then over on the right side, reality. Okay. But it's showing you how the model can be applied when you're looking at a geography that, has a river running through it, and has, maybe some land where there's, it isn't flat and featureless. There's some hills, and, it might be a little bit, kind of, some areas that have better soil than others. And so, we have over time taken a look at the model in some ways where you can kind of convert it into the reality of what real geography looks like. The concept of comparative advantage that I mentioned there in number 2, keep in mind what that is all about, okay? Because that is, pulling away from, again, this criticism of von Thunen's model, and thinking about the fact that regardless, whether you're talking about land that is flat and featureless, or has all kinds of peaks and valleys and mountains and hills and rivers and streams and lakes, all that sort of thing, it doesn't matter, because always, always, always at the end, you're going to have humans at the end of it all who are determining what land is valuable and what land isn't. Okay. And when we think of comparative advantage, it just means there's always going to be some land that is considered to be better than other land. And it might be because the soil is better, and so you can use it for agricultural activity, and it's easier to do because the soil is just a better quality. It might be that there's a better climate in that area, and that too makes it either more livable, more farmable, those kinds of things. There's always going to be certain things that are going to just by nature automatically are going to provide advantage to some areas over others. Okay. All right. And as we start kind of getting ourselves winding down here to where we're going to kind of leave von Thunen's model behind. We'll call that enough of a kind of a deep dive here for now. Is another area that we've seen change over time. Is that as we've left the era of carts and wagons and that sort of thing, and now trains and trucks and aircraft and and even refrigerated and those cool chains and everything that we talk about. Now we can look at von Thunen's model as having these massively wide rings instead of just being kind of localized to one little kind of region or area. Now we can start thinking about these huge rings. They give some examples, different ways of looking at the United States as this. And I mean, the way you can think about this now is the floral industry. Okay, we just celebrated the main flower giving day of the year here just recently with Valentine's Day. And the majority of flowers that are sold in the United States aren't grown in the United States. A lot of them come from more tropical areas. If you think about the East Coast, a lot of the flowers that are going to be sold in florist shops, or sent through mail order places, that do the flower delivery. A lot of them are grown down in the Caribbean, and I mean, does it cost a lot of money to get them from the Caribbean to the marketplaces on the East Coast? Yeah, it does. But they're going to still sell those flowers at such a profit that it's gonna basically cover the cost of transportation and then some, and still provide profits for the companies that do that. And so, that really skews the ideas of the rings that von Thunen was thinking about in 1826, because now those rings are extending beyond, the continental boundaries of the United States, our national boundaries, and bringing in other areas. But that is what, again, some of these advancements in transportation have done. And you could also talk about, another way that von Thunen's model has, we've kind of had to adapt it to our more modern times that we have here. All right. Okay. And like I said, from there, I think we're going to kind of move into some different topic areas. We're probably not 100% done with von Thunen, but that kind of gets us into the heart of what this theory is, what the limitations are, how it's changed over time. All right. And hopefully you feel like you're a little bit more of a kind of, I don't know, kind of a brainiac when it comes to that. All right. Modification of the natural ecosystem. All right, let's start jumping into this one, okay? Like I said, kind of a different topic here. So, we talked about, as we've seen time move from, kind of going back to von Thunen's day, where it was a lot of small kind of regional farms, family farms, and then we've seen the move into large-scale farming, agribusiness, transnationals, all these different kind of where farming has gone, suitcase farming, so farming that has gone large scale. All right, we definitely have seen some negative impacts. That's why we got the thumbs down to the landscape. As the bigger these farms get, and so that's kind of where we're going to dig into here. What we have seen, as we can look at the long stretch of history, and the little chart I've got over there starts in the 1800s and takes us all the way as close as 2018. And you can see how things are changing over time as we see large-scale farming becoming more and more the norm, okay? And so we've seen extreme loss of grasslands over that period of time. We've seen some shrinkage of forest over that time, and we've seen a big increase in some of that grazing land for livestock. So you see these shifts that are taking place, and then we also see where crops have expanded over time, and a lot of it, it's kind of adjustments into how people eat in the 21st century versus back in the 19th century. And then also the fact that our global population has basically, more than quadrupled since the 19th century. Okay, so we definitely can see that loss in forest land. And again, some people say, "Oh, wow, so we don't have as many trees. So what?" But again, remember, whenever we talk about these impacts on natural ecosystem, if you remember in your science classes, hopefully you've learned, or you will learn, that, I mean, our planet, it's a very delicate kind of a balancing act that we play with this planet, and and how we'd still depend on whether it's trees, grasslands, plants, whatever. I mean, those help to provide the oxygen that you and me need to continue to live, and all the other living, creatures on this planet. And to think that we can just, destroy, just completely change the face of the planet, and not to have negative impacts, you're going to come back to have all these effects on us as a species, and animals, all the others. That would be some really irresponsible kind of thinking. And so we do always have to think about a balancing act here, okay? And as you can see, the balance has changed, not just completely upside down, but you can see the change in the balance over the last couple hundred years, okay? We've mentioned this before, and this is some of these elements of the green revolution, where people, when they talk about, there's some real positives that we can anchor onto with the green revolution, but there's some negatives as well. And we have seen with the advent of all these new chemical fertilizers that are introduced during the green revolution, that the incidence of pollution of rivers and lakes has definitely increased over time. Okay, as we've seen an increase in livestock farming, we've seen the instance of overgrazing, where animals are allowed to pretty much when they're allowed to, especially when they naturally graze. They're not in those CAFOs where they're being concentrated together, but when they're allowed to naturally graze, but they're allowed to graze over and over again in the same land, year after year after year. It's kind of that same idea that if you keep planting that land, that basically over time you destroy the soil itself, and it can result in some of that desertification, where pretty soon it's unusable land. Right? You got to pick up your animals and pretty much herd them somewhere else. And but if you're practicing the same thing over again, you're just going to be seeing more of that desertification happening elsewhere. Okay, and then water disputes. There's some people, I don't know if I 100% buy into this, but anything's possible, who have suggested that if World War III is ever to happen on this planet, and we pray that doesn't, that it quite possibly would be over water. Okay, access to water. And I know we think about, look at the oceans, and look at it. It doesn't seem like there's any shortage of water. But as we think the fact that we're still a growing planet, all right. And I'm not going to try to argue too much with Hans Rosling and tell me don't panic. But we do have some concerns about access to water going into the future. And we've seen where even here in the United States, where sometimes we have states who get into basically political / even kind of financial arguments with each other over water access, and the way that we use water and need water, especially in some of our parts of the country, the Southwest, where it's a little bit more harder to come by, and the fact that we rely on that water not only for just the basic purpose of water to drink, water for plumbing purposes, water to water plants. Think about the food machine video that we watched, and they talked about the role that water plays, especially in some of those parts of California that used to be pretty much almost kind of like desert. Those are real issues, and the future does look kind of cloudy on some of those. And knowing that the future probably is going to mean more disputes over water. All right. Again, whether it ends up resulting in a world war over it, I don't know. Hopefully, as humans are smart enough to find another solution before it ends up something like that. Okay. Loss of wetlands has been another of one of the impacts of more of this large scale farming. So much so that, excuse me here, so much so that, here in the Pacific Northwest, when new developers are, building new neighborhoods and things like that, and it's going to be built on a place where there is a natural wetland, oftentimes those developers have to develop an artificial wetland to replace the one that they are building over. And that is a nod towards the fact that, we need these wetlands. They are every bit as much as important to the water system, our natural water system, and to keeping our planet, our planetary systems in balance. And so that is another one that again, you could argue it's like, it's just what? So what? You lose a swamp. So what? No, it's all part of the balance. Okay. And then, when we alter the landscape, we're impacting everything. Whether it's that terrace farming, whether it is the removal of one wetland and creating an artificial wetland, this has impacts on various types of waterfowl and animal species. And then, if those are impacted, then some of the predators that that live off of those kinds of species, then they're impacted. We just see like this cascade of impacts and consequences that can come out of this. And all of it starting with the fact that, agricultural activity, where we're farming because we need the food, and we need the food because, growing populations and all of that. All right. For the longest time, I would say for the better part of 200 years, most of the world didn't care about this. It's just kind of like, hey, it's the planet. We can just kind of pretty much beat up on this thing and it'll just always, somehow, I don't know, it'll always magically snap back. It's the planet. What else is it going to do? Just is going to give up on us? By the 1970s, there were scientists saying, yeah, we could lose our home if we continue to just kind of, continue to use practices that don't protect the planet and just take away from it. And so, it is no big surprise. 1970, I think, was when the first Earth Day takes place, and we start to see these efforts being made to better protect the planet. And try to, again, when I talk about nowadays, those developers having to trade out, that's not something that existed even probably 20, 30 years ago, but is now very much kind of part and parcel of how things operate nowadays. Okay, I think you know what, that is a great place to hit the brakes. I just hit 30 minutes, and it's putting us in a good place where we need to be to try to get these notes wrapped up together when we're with each other next week. So, agricultural innovations is where we will pick up together next week when we're back together in class. All right, that'll give us some good progress for now, and until then, yeah, take care.